All right, well, velkommen alle sammen. And welcome Esther and Susie. Thanks for making it here and for accepting the invitation. I'm Lars Bang Larsen. I'm the curator of Muses. And Esther Leslie is a professor at Birkbeck College in London. And Suzanne Treister is an artist also based in London and in the French Pyrenees. And Esther and Susie are both very important people to Muses. They have supplied content to the exhibition. Esther wrote the wonderful catalog essay Ars Technica in Etereality, a title that we also borrowed for this event. And of Susie, we have no less than 4 decades worth of artistic production in the exhibition. More than that, Susie and Esther are also very present as inspirations to the exhibition, I should say. Their work and their research and their critical attitudes and their critical imaginations have been points of departures for my curatorial attempt at dealing with the question of art and technology. Another reason for bringing Susie and Esther here today and bringing them together here today is also I think that you have things in common. I mean, Esther comes from academia, Susie comes from art making, but one common feature of their respective projects is, I think, that when you read Esther's texts and when you look at Susie's works and read her works as well, you get a sense that they channel a kind of collective dreaming. You get a sense that history is dreaming, that history in itself is a kind of artificial intelligence that is playing with itself. So that's, but maybe we can tease out more similarities or tensions between your works as we go along today. I know you're not going to advertise your production today, but I just want to mention a few book titles by each of you, because if you haven't already done so, I think that after having listened to Susie and Esther, you will want to read them and familiarize yourself even more with their production. A couple of books that I have read by Esther is this one from 2000, Hollywood Flatlands, Animation, Critical Theory and the Avant-Garde, about the role and the presence in Hollywood of the historical avant-garde and the role in the animated image. And there's this more recent work, Liquid Crystals, the science and art of a fluid form, in which Esther chases the trope of liquid crystals from early modernity and up to liquid crystal displays. It's a kind of history of ideas and of political history and of aesthetic history. This book by, I should say that Susie is also, apart from being a prolific artist and a brilliant artist, she is also a prolific bookmaker. This is the latest one, From Survivor F to the Escapist Black Hole Spacetime. I'll just read a bit of the blurb for you to get the gist. From Survivor F to the Escapist Black Hole Spacetime draws on recent research into artificial intelligence and astrophysics to create hallucinogenic imaginings of spaces of human and non-human understanding within and beyond those of contemporary science and technology. We'll begin today with a talk by Susie. She'll speak about her work in the exhibition and otherwise, I think. And Susie's talk will be followed by a mini lecture by Esther titled Muses, Thoughts on Matter and Transformation. And here Esther will talk about Turbid Media, and I think in Swedish that would translate to something as grumliga media or röriga media. After that, we'll have a talk between all of us, I hope. Yeah. I don't very often feel like Kermit the Frog from the Muppet Show, but this is one such occasion. So Please welcome Esther Leslie and Suzanne Treister. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, so I'm going to do this talk from my website. So I guess my website is possibly, in a way, part of the whole thing. I started this website in 1995, and it started off only for web-based projects because that was my kind of ethics, that you didn't just plonk your work on a website, you used it as a medium. And then as time went on, it was inevitable I had to use it as an archive for everything I'd ever done. So you're welcome to look at it at home. It's got probably, well, it's like 25 years of effort put into this website. It's not done on WordPress. It's done on my own computer using Dreamweaver, and it's a labyrinth where each, for example, so on the right-hand side are kind of smaller projects, and on the left-hand side are all the more major projects I've done, and each one kind of leads on to about 1 million other images, and sometimes to web-based projects themselves. So to start roughly at the beginning, I'm going to spend like 2 seconds on this, and I might start talking really fast at some point. So in the 80s, I left art school in 82 and in London, and I was a painter, and I was making work since about 85. I was making work which I thought was history painting, which was using images from other sources, all kinds of sources basically, from art history and from catalogues and from postcards from everywhere, to kind of reinvent different historical and future scenarios. At the time, this work was considered postmodern because it was considered that I'd appropriated this imagery, and therefore kind of like this work was then about the death of the author, and it was completely meaningless, and it was really annoying. And so, but what happened is, through these, I'll give you an example. This is one, this painting was from 85, Venus on TV on the Moon, which is probably my first art and technology work, I think, probably. But then what happened is, in the late 80s, hold on, no. It's not my computer, that's why I can't use it. In the late 80s, I started going into video game arcades. I had this boyfriend who was like totally hooked on video games, and I spent a lot of time in there. And I started to, well, I had a lot of time where I was really bored, and I started to think about what these games might be about. You know, obviously there was a lot of kind of shoot 'em ups at the time, and there was a lot of kind of gender stuff. There was a lot of kind of sci-fi. There was the whole thing was the fact that it was this new technology. Really, I hadn't seen all this kind of computer stuff anywhere else, and it was strange. It only seemed to exist in video game arcades, and I started to wonder, what does this mean? Like, what this is like the future inside these game parlors? What's going on? Where's it going to go? What's it going to mean for society? What's it going to mean for the world? How is this going to develop? Is this going to enter our lives? What's the potential of this in a bigger sense? And at that point I thought, well, maybe I should write a book about this, but I didn't. But then about 10 years later everyone else did, so it didn't really matter. But what I started doing was these, and this is one of the earliest works in the show. I started making these works which are fictional video game paintings, because since I was painting, that was my medium. And so I set up a scenario where at the top you've got these kind of Picasso monsters, Picasso-style painted monsters, and they go through this, they have to find their way, you would think, through this labyrinth of books, and come out the other end. A very simple thing, but setting up relationship between things that weren't normally in the subject of video games, but using the idea of the structure of video games where there would be a kind of narrative, there would be an action. And I think I've always really been interested in narrative in my work. So that was like a way of doing it, in a sense, because... and so this one, for example, was called Koons Kiefer video game, where this horse represents like the kind of kitsch of Jeff Koons, and these birch trees, books, the book spines represented Anselm Kiefer. There was the other one in the show is this one, where in some of them I actually used photographs I'd taken in the video game arcades of the screen. So that in the middle is a specific screenshot from a game, and then around it I invented other imaginary parts of the game, like in another dimension, I suppose. So what happened is I was doing these. I did hundreds of them, and then in 1991 I was in the middle of reading William Gibson's Neuromancer, and I just thought, fuck this, I really want a computer. And so I had £300 in the bank, and I went up to Tottenham Court Road in London, where there were these shops, and I found out you could buy a computer called an Amiga, which had like a very primitive painting program on it. And so I got it. I came home, and like it was really weird. Like in about 2 minutes, you could just start to use it. I'd never done anything like this before. It was like mind blowing. I could suddenly have this palette on the side, and I could make these brush marks and kind of paint with splodges of stuff, you know, and so I started making fictional video game stills on a computer rather than as paintings. And I could do them like in 5 minutes. I could do this, you know, and then I could use text on it, and it all seemed to kind of make sense. So probably for about a year and a half, I was making these, and I was also thinking about things like virtual reality, because there was this place in London, and there was like a special Sega game world on top of this big building, where you could actually get on the virtual reality headset, and you went onto this platform in outer space, and these people came down these staircases and tried to kill you, and it was really interesting, because if you walked to the side, to the edge of this checkerboard platform in outer space and tried to jump off, you couldn't. So you had this really weird sense of, you know, it was interesting to experience virtual reality in 1991 or something. And so I wanted to make some things about that as well. Where was I? So, sorry. So the top few, this was a series about this virtual space. So this one is not enough memory for operation. I started playing around with these kind of window things, these message things that would come up on your screen to tell you, you know, your computer was going wrong. And I was in very early days, so it was like suddenly this seemed like a really novel thing, that these messages would come up. So I incorporated them into some of these works. Presumed virtual breakdown, and now enter a virtual wilderness. Software failure, please enact repetition of the crime. Error, finding question. No message. Then this is some of the others that I did. And so some of these are in a big grid downstairs, a selection of them. Oh, that one doesn't exist. No, we seem to have lost the signal. Hold on. Oh, there we go. There. So, okay, so I did a lot of them. And then what happened is, in 1992, I moved to Adelaide in South Australia. I met this guy who's sitting there over there. And I gave it all up, this London thing, and I moved to South Australia, and I couldn't afford to take my Amiga computer with me, and I couldn't afford to buy one when I got there. I borrowed one for a brief time, but basically I was back to my own resources. And what I made from 93, 94, I spent a lot of time making these imaginary software boxes. So you've got to imagine, this was a time when most people didn't have a computer, and where software was basically like a word processing or accounting software, very primitive imaging software, and things that people use, I suppose, in industry and things like more kind of specialized. But there was nothing like apps, you know, there was nothing like bits of software that would do all kinds of different things. But so in 93, I decided to invent them ahead of time. So this is some of them. Hold on. And there's about 5 of them downstairs in one of the cases. And some of them were a bit horrible, you know, like your file questions answered or interactive torture chambers. And I think it was when I was doing this, if you've noticed, I've incorporated into some of them this. Now we've gone past it. Now I've said that. Hold on, let's get down to the bottom first. Yeah, I made the individual discs. So these were the discs that you got at the time, these floppy discs. And so I painted an image on the actual disc itself, and then I painted the box. So it was like you used to get software in boxes, like that. But you can see some of these are of this castle, which is actually Schloss Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, this castle which was built by this King Ludwig, and which is now a tourist destination. I think I got really obsessed about the interior of that castle, and I kind of remapped it all. So I reinvented it with different furnishings and different things. And I imagined that on the walls I imagined it was like a virtual castle, and I imagined on the walls to be millions of different paintings, which were virtual paintings inside a virtual castle. So I was like creating with this project here. Would you recognise a virtual paradise? It's a series of a lot of paintings. I didn't photograph them all. There's like millions of them all down here. A lot of paintings which are things which happen inside this castle. So, for example, this would be a curtain, and there would be like a virtual menu, like a computer window coming up, which gave you the option to bark, growl, or quack. There would be like something like another curtain where this would come up, ethical hallucinations, and you had to choose save, enter, or corrupt. And then various scenes inside the actual rooms. So that's a very early JPEG, which was really small, but it was really big at the time. And then this one, for example, floating, flying, falling. What happened is I was doing all that, and then in 1995, I invented this alter ego, or avatar, or heteronymic identity called Rosalind Brodsky. And this was like a huge turning point, because I started off the first works I made for Rosalind Brodsky. The first thing I made actually was I wrote a short biography, and the story went that Rosalind Brodsky was an artist in the 1990s in London, and what happened is she went to Paris on a trip. She managed to have a psychoanalytic session with the psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva, and it was during that session that suddenly Julia Kristeva reminded her of her grandmother, who'd been killed in the Holocaust, of whom she'd only seen one photograph, which her father had colorized in the 1970s. And at this moment, she had this experience, her first experience of time travel. Whether this was hallucinated or delusional or real, it's never really said. So she had this experience of time travel, and this kind of carried on. It's like she had a parallel life. So on the one hand, she was teaching new media at St. Martin's in the 90s, although St. Martin's in the 90s didn't have a new media course. It didn't even know how to do anything with new media. Then, and on her other life, she was working in the 21st century, which I know we are now in a place called the Institute of Millitronics and Advanced Time Interventionality. And this institute carried out time travel-based research, which could have been based on virtual simulations of key points in history, or could have been real time travel. Again, that was never stated. She worked for this institute, and so that was the beginning of the biography. And so what I made first, which are downstairs, in the mid-90s, I made these 3 time travel costumes, one to go to the 1960s, one to go to the Holocaust to rescue her grandparents, and one to go to the Russian Revolution. And a series of attaché cases, and a series of... So these are the attaché cases. There's 2 of them. That one is downstairs. That's a case for going into virtual reality and emergency. This one was a case for visiting her father at the time of his birth, and this one was a case for embracing Judaism, and that was like a family portrait inside the box taken in an English seaside resort where my father was wearing the false beard. Then she made, Rosalind Brodsky then made these things called electronic body nets, and they were like kind of parallels to the costumes. They were also to take you to those similar destinations, but you could wear them in a different, they would function in a different way. And then she made a series of feature vibrators. Where are they here? They're not on this particular menu. So I'll have to go to another menu. Hold on. They're probably here. So there was a book with this in there. So what happened is, so I made the costumes, I made lots of digital images, and then in 96, 97, I started making an interactive CD-ROM. And this was at the time a really new technology where it was like you could use this program called Director, and it was an authoring program, so it enabled you to essentially make an entire piece of software which was self-functioning. I don't think people make them anymore. But basically, it was, so-called multimedia. You could bring together all media together into a huge timeline where you could have images and video and sound and animation and absolutely everything. And it was interactive. You could code it so that if you're going in a room and you can, if you click, you can move. You know how the Google van, you can move through the roads now and like that. You could do all that then with this program. So you could move through a room, you could touch something on the wall, it would open a window, something would come through the window, and it would tell you something, and then you walked across the other side, you opened the door, you went through into another room, a screen came down, a whole movie played, endless things. You just had to make the images, the videos, and I did lots of chroma key videos where I could get Rosalind Brodsky to appear in a room, for example. So I shouldn't start there. So this CD-ROM is in the show, but it's usually very difficult for anyone to see it because there's the disc. You can buy it on eBay or something. There's a disc, but generally you need a 1997 computer to use it, unless you're really clever and you know how to make a contemporary computer think that it's a 1997 computer, which can be done. So when I started the CD-ROM, it was like going to be the whole story of Rosalind Brodsky, starting from the year 2058, the date of her death, and there was a memorial event to celebrate her life at this Institute of Electronics, and they took you into... So this is the pages of the book, because the book is a parallel. They took you into her study. This is her study. You rotated around it. You could look at her time-traveling diary on her desk. You could teleport to Schloss Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, where that was actually her home, where there was all her musical instruments and all her various things playing in the living room, like her cookery TV show and the pop videos of her band, which were really successful in Eastern Europe in the 2030s. And you could go into this wardrobe here behind her desk, which had her costumes in, and then if you found a key, you could go down through the back of the wardrobe, down a lift into this place called the clinics. I'll just get some of these images up. So, and if you went into the clinics, there were these 5 couches there for 5 psychoanalysts of the previous century, so Freud, Jung, Klein, Lacan, and Kristeva. You could zoom into each couch individually, and the headset would come down. It would go beep, 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 and you press a button, and then you come out, and you're in their study. And what would happen is they would... so this is Rosalind Brodsky in Lacan's room, which obviously wasn't his real room. It's like a virtual sci-fi hallucination of his home, and then he would explain that she'd come to him for analysis, because the point of these clinics, I forgot to mention, is that these time travel researchers are really stressed out doing all this historical stuff and time travel. So because in the 21st century psychoanalysis had declined, they needed to go back in time for psychoanalysis, and so it was like a facility in the basement of the institute to allow them to do this. And Rosalind Brodsky being, more traumatized than the rest, had gone to every single psychoanalyst, and they'd each written a case history about her. And so when you go down there, each one will tell you that they've written a case history and show it to you. So in the book, all these case histories are printed out, and all these pages here. But in the CD-ROM, you can click on them and you can open them and scroll, turn the pages and read them. Then in that wardrobe here, in this wardrobe, if you open up the bottom drawer, you'll find that there's the attaché cases, but also there's the attaché case for the feature vibrators. Now, she made these for when she went back in time, she could sell them in Paris and London in various sex shops to pay for her psychoanalysis. So there's a version of it on the internet where they kind of move up and down, but there's a version of it on the CD-ROM where they actually talk. So that's usually where people get stuck when the CD-ROM gets played. You can find that you go in and people think it's only about these feature vibrators. Then, just to quickly get through this, when you finally go through the castle of Neuschwanstein, you come out onto a balcony and you are able to. Where are we? You're able to take this satellite, this shuttle, up to her satellite spy probe in outer space, where she's constructed it out of Christo's Reichstag from Berlin from 1995, with a built simulacrum of the actual thing underneath, so that it's looks like this thing at the bottom, and it's been in outer space for like a lot of her life. And it tells you that in her, so you go in the shuttle, you actually go into outer space, you see her flying by, you come in, the door clunks open, and you're in there, and they explain that in her later life she spent a lot of her time up there taking photos from outer space, and she made a series of painting games which appear on this console, which you can actually play, which you've got a picture, you can bring up a whole picture of the United Nations, for example, and then using the various painting tools like Photoshop, you can draw over it with, for example, some of the vibrators, with blood, with snow, with all kinds of different materials to create your own scene. And then when you leave the space probe, and go back into the shuttle, you're given the opportunity to either go back to the castle to her music room, or to go to an opal mining town in Kubapidi, where you're able to stay overnight in an underground dugout and escape. And I forgot the key point at the beginning, is that when you go into her study at the beginning, you're told that you're trapped in time travel, because outside the building is a armed group of university professors who are demonstrating against the institute and its kind of fake kind of anthropological research. So basically, you've got to find your own way out. So I think we come to the end of Rosalind Brodsky. So then, I think what happened around about 2000, I'd finished the CD-ROM, I'd done all this. It's like there's about 1 million more things I haven't told you about it. But a lot of it was about her and about history, and I think what I wanted to work out is this institute, this military institute in the future. I'd never really said what research they carried out, and I thought, I have to know what it was. And so I guess I believed that somewhere I knew, and that I would just have to kind of ease it out of myself. And so I did a whole series of time travel research projects, which was supposedly carried out at the Institute. And I haven't got time to go through them all, but they led up to They led up to Hexen 2.0, which was the one that stopped being about Rosalind Brodsky completely and did away with the umbrella fiction of an imaginary time traveller. But this project could only happen because I'd been doing these really massive historical research projects as if they were done by a military institute. And so could you just tell me how long I've got? Because I don't know what time you actually stopped talking. 5 minutes. So, okay. So, Hexen 2.0 really started because I got really interested in the idea of cybernetics and in the current state of the internet, which was in 2009, and the kind of control society where the data collection, all the social networks that had been like collecting everyone's data, no one seemed to be bothered about it. Everyone thought I was a paranoid conspiracy theorist. And so what I did is I researched the whole I researched the entire history of the internet, of computers, of and in relation to the counterculture, in relation to utopic and dystopic versions of the world in science fiction, and specifically in relation to this thing called the Macy Conferences, which took place between 1946 and 1953 in New York, which brought together a whole series of core group of 30 scientists, from the hard sciences to the soft sciences, who were essentially there to develop a theory of cybernetics and a unified theory of the human mind in order to control it. And they were quite key people like John von Neumann, who was head of the Atomic Commission in America, who went on to do a whole range of things. There was anthropologist Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. They went on to do other things. But there was Norbert Wiener, who did anti-aircraft missile research in the war, which was cybernetic feedback loop based. And so what I realized is that the internet, the Web 2.0, which is the internet when it became interactive, was essentially a cybernetic feedback loop, which meant that it was a controlling mechanism. And I wanted to explain this to everyone so they could stop fucking giving everything away and causing our future to become a fucking nightmare. And no one listened to me, as I said, but it was okay because Edward Snowden came along and told them a few years later, but then they still didn't care. But so there's these big diagrams of those histories, and then I made a tarot deck to actually help people to work through those ideas themselves. So you'd get this kind of random selection of cards, which would then mean that you could come up with your own possible versions of the future and ideas for the future, and step outside of this inevitability that was happening. So I made these. These are downstairs as well, and they bring together all those areas I've just spoken about. And I have to move on really fast now. After the Snowden thing, I was really like, oh God, over it. No one gave a shit. So I made this series called Post-Surveillance Art, which was, meant that, it was about our surveillance society being a given, and moving on to kind of describe that in a kind of almost poetic, hallucinogenic way where that's already who we are. And so it's like semi-critical, semi-not, semi-like... I can't really explain right now. Then I did a project called HFT the Gardener, which takes another half an hour to explain, but it's all on here, about a banker who became an outsider artist through the use of hallucinogenic drugs, plants. And then this project, my last but one project, Survivor F, which is it's set in an unspecified time in the future. It could be a post-apocalyptic time where possibly there's only one survivor of the human race, who might be Survivor F, or this survivor might be a machine intelligence. And so I've done... slow down. Oh, the internet has slowed down. Oh yeah. So I've done all these paintings for this project. And all these watercolors. And then a video and various other things. I'll quickly tell this interim one. This is when I had residency last year at CERN, and I made a project called the Holographic Universe Theory of Art History, where I'd been interested in this theory of the holographic universe, and I had this... is my own theory that all of art history was just a means of actually a subconscious attempt to describe our holographic reality rather than all the other supposed reasons that people made art. And I made a video where I fast forwarded a huge chronology of art history from cave painting to now, as you can see there, to test my theory in the same way that the Large Hadron Collider at CERN accelerates particles to test its theories. Then my very last project, which I can talk about in 1 minute, The Escapist, Black Hole Space-Time. Lars can show you the book afterwards. The Escapist is a non-specific interplanetary entity, and I'll read it, whose depicted experiences are a poetic imagining of spaces of understanding within and beyond those of contemporary science. So one of the beginning points was this. Hang on, I'm going to go back. A comic strip, 52-page comic strip, which is quite abstract, and it's his strange thoughts, or his, I don't know if it's a he, it's the strange thoughts and theories of someone of an entity that is possibly living in a black hole, possibly living in another parallel universe. It's never clear. And these portals I made, it was part of a Serpentine digital commission, are part of the project, and they are able to be downloaded as your desktop background images, so that interface between your reality and the reality beyond the screen is intercepted by these black hole portals with an event horizon and like a specific text, so that you enter the internet or enter wherever it is in a different sense. And again, I did another very long series of paintings for this project. That's this one, for example. Hold on. I think I'll stop here. I've run out of time, haven't I? Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, okay. Let's just get my images up. Thank you. Okay. So, yes, this is Muses, Thoughts on Matter and Transformation. And I want to start in the mud. In the mud from which we come, perhaps, although who is we? I start in the mud because it's an emblem of what has always been and is newly current. Matter, material, materiality. So mud as a primal matter. Our age, perhaps like any age, forces an engagement with materials, with old ones examined or brought to light for new and expansive purposes, and new ones, products of second and third nature, engineered, nano-engineered, never seen before, generating new uses. In a world of 3D printing, in an age when prediction cedes to the superior systems of higher level, complex, unpredictable predictability, or the valorization of what are called in scientific terms interesting behaviors. A significant amount of attention turns in the scientists' laboratories to soft matter, liquids, colloids, polymers, foams, gels, aerosol mists, granular materials, and liquid crystals. Many of these materials are self-organizing, atomically capricious materials. They possess capacities such as liquid crystals' birefringence, its generalized elasticity, its mesoscopic intermediate scale, symmetry-breaking degrees of freedom, coupled with responsiveness to inputs. Matter is on the scene again, new and anciently old. Matter has history, or how it comes to matter has history. How quaint and old-fashioned some old matter such as clay might seem in the age of plastics, of throwaway plastic containers that pile up as toxic mountains and seep into the ground or into the sea. The thrown stuff that is clay, that cousin of mud, seems like the good and pretty sister of the evil one who is thrown away but never disappears. The philosopher Ernst Bloch wrote about an old pitcher, a dark brown clumsy jug with a face on it, in 1918. He imagines himself inside that jug, inside its belly. Bloch wonders what it looks like inside the dark, spacious belly of these pictures. He would like to occupy that space, just as a child might actually sneak inside a large vase out of curiosity. Bloch treasured the cloddish and crude, the brown, heavy, inhabitable jug. Whoever looks long enough at the picture soon begins to carry its colour and form with him. Not every puddle I step in makes me grey. Not every railroad track bends me round a corner. But I could probably be formed like the picture, see myself as something brown, something peculiarly organic, some Nordic amphora. And not just mimetically or simply empathetically, but so that I thus become, for my part, richer, more present, cultivated further toward myself by this artifact that participates in me. That is true of all things that have grown, and here in drinking pictures the people laboured to express their pleasure and their deeper sense of contentment, to affix themselves to these implements of the household and the public house. Everything that was ever made in this way out of love and necessity leads a life of its own, leads into a strange new territory, and returns with us formed as we could not be in life, adorned with a certain, however weak, sign, the seal of ourself. So much romanticism, expressionism, romantic anti-capitalism, perhaps in a philosophy of use and love, where the jug grows like a plant grows, and a self might be sent inside it, internalized in its form, and so too that self is externalized in its form. This jug, the Bartmann-Krug, is a product of labour. It takes its place within a culture of use. Selves are expressed through it, the maker's self, the user's self. Yet it leads a life of its own, and it leads us, but we are made with it in this journey. We are, Bloch thinks, made through and of that clay. We are a mud, composed of weathered granite rock, of decomposed feldspar, drawing water into its crystal structure. We are golems, mudmen, inanimate matter that had life breathed into it. Bloch was the jug. Can we be the Tetra Pak? Can we be the coffee bar cappuccino cup? These things arrive with us from far away and do not seem to contain us. Tetra Pak made and makes pyramids of milk, colourful packages of juice. It sells these across the world. It's long done so. It now understands its mission to be embodied in the shape of the container that it invented in 1952. Its sterile, regular and rigid container that's far away from a mammary gland containing milk. Its corporate strategy is titled Deeper in the Pyramid, and it aims to deliver the milk pyramid to ever lower layers of the social pyramid, to those poorest people, those who might once have had a cow and the hands to milk it, were they not now to be persuaded that these old practices are unhygienic, disease-ridden. These poorest people are projected to remain poor, but a little of something from a lot of people can add up to a lot if you do the maths. And so these bodies will receive pyramids of low-value milk derivative. This is the world of industrialized, globalized capitalism. It has remade things from the bottom up, every practice, every process, every hand, that is now not a set of fingers curling and uncurling around udders or pots, but rather electrical conduits on touchscreen interfaces, triggering micro-events. In a world where technologies are badged as aseptic, clean, green, and yet the rubbish piles grow higher and higher. Don't we know these new vessels to be our enemy? For now they are marked as destroying our seas, our planet, and yet much as we revile them, their piles grow, We're not asked to curl up inside them, but sometimes the foam on a latte reflects something of its consumer back, or the froth on a cappuccino turns sculptural, emblem of our effervescent social form or foam. We are proximate bubbles, jostling, but not really touching. Our moments of meeting are brief and fragile. Froths and foams are especially transient. They are a nothingness held in time together and sold high in the case of coffee, or productive of toxicity in the case of frothy pollution foams, such as those that course periodically through Hyderabad or New Delhi or elsewhere, result of phosphate detergents and cosmetic waste gushing into rivers and turning them softly solid. The new mud, then, today is foam. Foams, airy forms of muds. Foams, slimes, sludges that draw in the fingers. Old muds still exist, but they become information. Sediment at the floor of the sea yielding information about history. Forms in the muddy slime of the seabed and lake bottoms are catalogued again. The phenotypes of bacterial and archaea lodged in mud, in vents, in hot springs, yield DNA and RNA and allow a full mapping of life, such that it might be made again, anew. And should any gaps be found in the whole universe of forms, then they might be plugged by engineering. New systems of cataloguing develop, DNA-based instead of conventional taxonomies, suiting the digital mode far better. Such information can be deployed efficiently. It does not need 26 letters to record it, but just 4, A, C, T, G. A luxury yacht owned by a venture capitalist scooped up the slime to make a bolus of new life. Sequenced and informatized, there could be a swift translation from DNA code to bank code. The mud yields much, and eventually, like everything else, transforms into money, value, and something spectral. And so it becomes something like its opposite, which is the air, or, better, something between the two, a muddied air. The muddied and clouded air of industrial farming's dirt tracks, with the loss of topsoil from irresponsible changes in land use in a new and coming dust bowl. Or the particulated air of pollution, a turbid, agitated air, thick with dusts. Atmosphere. This thing that should be light, aerated, floating, bobbing like utopian art's inflatable structures, now stiffens. These encapsulations of air from hot air balloons onwards have always moved between military applications, state-aggrandizing functions, avant-garde delight. To make an inflatable is to participate in the engineering of atmosphere, whether as signal of high-tech mastery over nature or as sign of a proximity to dreaming, to utopian fantasy. A prime location of this would be the 1970 Art Expo in Osaka, Japan, where the Fuji Group Pavilion for Expo 70 was the largest air-inflated structure in the world. Inside this structure of compressed air and plastic, the first IMAX screen was debuted. The pavilion's structure was of air, so it was continuously folding in on itself, responding to every wind gust, every shift in atmosphere. The expo had the theme, Progress and Harmony for Mankind. Elsewhere in the exhibit was, famously, the Pepsi-Cola Pavilion, designed by Rauschenberg's Global Initiative, EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. Robert Breer made some sculptures for the Pepsi structure. These were called floats. They move slowly and have battery-powered motors and little wheels, and although they move, it's often so slowly It takes you a while to notice. They were moved by onboard motors 6 inches per minute. The floats sometimes emitted gentle sounds of birds singing, of soaring, or voices talking about a beautiful landscape. And as it did this, the floats were immersed in artificial fog. Indeed, on approaching the Pepsi Pavilion, a veil of fog shrouded the whole origami-like structure. Fujiko Nakaya was the artist in charge of this fog skin, daughter of the man who created the first artificial snow crystal and then worked against sea fog in Manchuria in the context of military research. How is it that the aesthetic use of fog parallels instrumental scientific uses? The system of artificial fog production, by the way, has an afterlife. An updated version is now used as a means of air conditioning at data centers, where issues of temperature control are so key. Facebook's data center at Primeville in Oregon has developed an artificial fog system called Me-Fog to keep the data cool. Data centers. These are the material infrastructures that sustain surveillance capitalism, predict behaviors from consumption to pre-crime. Fog is a metaphor for being lost in the world, but then that very property of fog as confusing becomes operative, becomes used as smoke screens, or as something overcomable as dispersion technologies are invented. And then the fog is militarized, linked into a science and technology of environment that serves military ends, but it's also made aesthetic, mobilized for art. And if fog is an image for us being without bearings, lost in our contemporary environments in which left and right are rather confused and difficult to map, and technology confuses us and politics seems from another space, then is it not also the case that the fog in the fogged computers and the fog systems is also precisely about a certain locating in time and space, a very specific one? We are trackable. If an artist steps into the field of art and technology, it's always a messy field, a force field, a field of relations into which they step, and you really need to know how to use it without it using you. Who, what, where are we amidst the froth of modern technology, the brew of chemicals, and the agitated air of particulates and data streams? How are we? A small question, but a hard one. What do our solid bodies drawn from the mud and now annexed to the liquid crystal device still have to do around here? The body has in the past been apprehended by physiology, which pertains to the science of normal functions of living things or how bodies work. Physiology takes as its focus biochemistry, sugars, energy, the laws of thermodynamics. Physiology explores the functions of parts, of limbs, mechanisms, bodily processes within a living system, from the operations of little cells to the swinging of an arm to the interaction of a body with the atmosphere of its environment. Now that field of physiology is enmeshed with processes that are digital, computational, data-driven. This body science and body knowledge is remote, even when it is close. These apprehensions of bodily functioning might be characterized as tangling a physical body in a network of codes, commands, control, communication, inputs, outputs, electronic, engineered, fogged, clouded, or invisible. These points of entanglement become conceptualized at ever smaller grades. It's a long time since we could see any of this with our now rarely naked eyes. The body, the meat hunk that still lumbers around, is only proper, or only properly and fully apprehended, as a node through which a flow or a stutter of data passes, and is like every other node in that network, which as a whole forms an international or galactic network of connected parts, or an internet of things, amongst which this body, your body, is another thing, a punctuation point in a common language. And what is on the outside is far less interesting than what is on the inside, this interior that appears now as ghostly shadows. If we wish to know the functions of bodies today, we do not explore faces or lay hands on the shell of the skin. And we do not simply cut in and apart, using knowledge of anatomy to divide. We apprehend through media and their contiguity to quantification. And what was inside, intimate to the body, a wet and squelchy, messy realm to be known through measurement, touch, observation, incision, post-mortem analysis, is turned outside or made external in some hands-off kind of way, and in the form of more accurate, more intimate, more extravagant measures that slip well below the humanly measurable, to appear on screens somewhere or anywhere. Physiology now is communication engineering and is a matter for LCD and LED, for printouts, graphs, screens, silently somewhere and elsewhere processing, archiving, tagging, cross-referencing, aggregating. Bodies are conceived as realms of tiny happenings that are uninterrupted and accessed only by machineries, and where there was once a stethoscope and the MRI, there is now virtual reality and 3D imaging, total body PET CT scanners, which make an image or some sort of this flesh bag and its contents. But that is of less import than what is unseen, but known or knowable. It is number. We get to know this thing called our bodies through AI in its quantum parts, in the provisions of physics beyond the standard model. More prosaically, in daily life, bodies are quantified voluntarily and as play. In gamification procedures that measure steps, calorific intake. Through communications engineering, there's a cessation of the importance of the proximity of bodies to the hand of the surgeon, the statistical measure of biopolitical bureaucracy, the critical eye of the photographic apparatus. Bodies career away from knowing by hand, eye, and its translation into measure, moving towards participation in a generalized being of things in contactless contact. Bodies are committed to action at a distance. How the body fits together is an old question. The new one is how to send a message about them to elsewhere, across space and time, passing through bodies, from them, off them, about them, as well as through objects. Art has often used life as a model, taking lessons in anatomy and physiology. Now scientists make life as if it were art, or as if it were code. Life takes the name JCVI Sin 3.0, or perhaps Cynthia. And it is the minimum number of genes required to sustain something called life. Or is it something more like code? As the J. Craig Venter Institute puts it, a biological cell is very much like a computer. The genome is the software that encodes the instructions of the cell, and the cellular machinery is the hardware that interprets and runs the genome software. Major advances in DNA technologies have made it possible for biologists to now behave as software engineers and rewrite entire genomes to program new biological operating systems. If this life is made, how does it function, and what is physiology for it? If its genetics is an operating system, what does this operate? It operates more computers. It communicates with the network of computers. Its outputs are digitalized. This is its normal functioning as life. It awaits an upgrade. The capacity to informationalize even enters into the body, spliced onto our own information centers in order to be backlit on screens. The body is unbound from itself. Anatomy is a surge of atoms that are data. The body is bound. Never more located in time and space than now. Never more known, if only not to the self, tethered by engineered and unrelenting communications. And where the mid-century trembled under the atom bomb which threatened to burn and melt the bodies caught in its light, the new century crafts a data bomb. These bodies that are dissolving into data come to respond only to data as they make ever more of it. Data, meaning all that is given. Constant stimulation of a body-mind complex occurs by electronic signals all passing through the one portal, the screen, where love, sex, confession, shopping, work, play, crime take place sequentially or simultaneously. There's only the screen and the contacts file in the network society. The screen's diversity of inputs translates into diversity of outputs, and each subject flexibilizes him or herself in response. All fully flexibilized postmodern selves reproduce themselves multiply as lecturers, entertainers, vloggers, merch endorsers, Etsy sellers, TV station bosses, comic writers, DJs, record producers, military strategists, presidents, engaging in multiple performance tests on a platform where new times, new pile-ups and collapses take place, like that of post-continuity editing in newer action cinema and pop videos. A space of flows, of controlled chaos in which the camera makes no sense of action but renders only affect, something felt in staccato snippets of time, quick messages, random segues. And in this world our physiology is refitted as a set of components, assembled parts and processes, our gender, say, selected by hormone augmentation or semiotic suggestion or insistence. Bodies stream from themselves like a halo, like aura, like a mist condensing all the time, a new ether. Not mud, or mud only deep down, repressed, in favour of airy ether, matter not mattering. Not mud, but muddled. If we would wish to predict the future, look at female cows, because their bodies are the testing grounds of the new pastures to be engineered out of the dirt dust, the vanguard of bodies disassembled, reassembled, invested in and exchanged in the integrated circuit of agribusiness. Our bodies leach into theirs, theirs into ours. A weird emblem of futures appeared in September 2019 in a remote village in Argentina, where, as a result of spontaneous mutation caused by the action of mutagens, physical, chemical, or biological agents altering genetic sequencing, a cow was born with a human face. It lived but a few hours, unable to support the weight of its strange head. What muddled physiologies, what chimera's of our new age to come? We speak a common body language. They, cows, are the testing ground of new modes of IVF, so crucial is genetic breeding to their fate, and we will thanklessly adapt the results. Every cow in Ireland, for example, has a unique number. No cow is anonymous. The number of each cow is entered into a central government-managed database. No cow can stray. No cow is ever lost, but only ever tracked as it wanders green pastures to make milk and butter for export. Each mouthful of milk might be traced to source. Farming is a highly technologized business with data another output of agriculture. There are so many herd software platforms on the market. Breeding, vaccinations, lactation events can all be monitored. An Irish company, Canthus, has developed a digital vision system that gathers information on each animal in order to passively monitor cows 24/7 and analyse their well-being, productivity and performance, alerting you, the farmer, when it matters most, they say, through daily notification to a phone and detailed analytics. If one cow is acting aberrantly or feeding erratically, the system will know, and in real time. How much milk a cow produces is measured, even if this is sometimes averaged across herds. This data can be combined with other data sets, for example with meteorological data, to produce parameters for smart grazing. There's a wish to know how much each cow eats, drinks, if she is lame, or her udders inflamed and in need of medical attention, if she is acting in ways that are coded as strange. Cow cortisol will be tracked, the stress levels monitored and annexed to production outputs. The system will understand the time budget for cows in each pen and identify areas for improvement. Is there enough food, too much water? Is she drinking enough compared to the others? And if these anomalies can be eradicated, then production will rise and the milk will not be spoilt. She can always make more milk. The system monitors the key animal and dairy farm performance indicators, enabling you, the farmer, to gain vital knowledge and actionable insights to improve your farm's overall profitability and productivity. The readouts will join up in a mass refrain. The cow is quantified like the self has been quantified. The cow is numbered, the milk is numbered, the butter is numbered, the days are numbered. Human technologies are given back to them too and adapted in their lights. The systems developed now rely on cow facial recognition technologies, originally arranged to map the flattish faces of humans. The elongated heads of cows are hard to map, and so the colour patterns on their hides feature as a sign of their uniqueness. The cows do not hold still enough for their portraits to be made. That system is designed for large firms with many cows who do not roam in pastures. Irish farms with their few hundred animals making their way around pastures evade the camera look. This one is for North American barn-based cows, held still in their mega farms. We may be too, in the private, faux public spaces of a new London, in the former landscapes of labour turned high-end consumerism, where we roam on privatised, high-cost consumer pastures, clutching our flat whites of aerated milk. The facial recognition software is never off, soundlessly watching, actively communicating, a policeman in the sky, on the edge of the building. Cryopreservation techniques were pioneered on cow gametes in the 1940s. What freezings in our social world might this bio-experimentation facilitate yet? In retrospect, the cyborg seemed intelligible, at least in the way it entered imaginations and fell from the lips of 1,000 boosters. As something recognizable from the Hollywood movies, an augmented self with some sort of prothesis, contact lenses, a pacemaker, some sort of any sort of assignation with technology. The cyborg jabs fingers at a screen. We are all cyborgs. The scary new networks were only as frightful as a cyberpunk thriller with a darkly ambiguous ending. How that engagement swelled, how that rendezvous became a colonization, and what more there is yet to come. Bodies built out of web detritus with AI drawing down on neural networks that outbid the eye-peppered psychedelia of deep dream, interbred with fibre optic cables, perhaps. Or some bot-bred deep-fake bodies whose sphere of influential operation is the 24/7 corridors of social media. Physiology is a matter only for the non-matter of the screen, the agonies of the junkie, the big business of detoxing. Everything else is the message in the guise of a medium, a between, a substance, amorphous, shifty, hard to grasp, but impossible to ignore. Turbid Media is the name given by physicists to muddy water or particularly polluted air, in which the particles of poisonous dust are so dense as to be visible. How to think about turbid media, not from the perspective of the physicist measuring propagation of light and other optical properties for determined ends, but from the perspective of a critic, of someone who is within that turbidity, inside the muddy, turbid worlds, the seabeds churned up and dispersed, or silted up to flood the plains and make all into mud. How to get a distance on it while being stranded in it. So thank you. I think we're going to...
Thank you so much, Susie and Esther. for your wonderful presentations. There's lots to talk about. We don't have so much time, but I think we'll do a quick talk between us and then open the floor to questions. I've been thinking about similarities and tensions between your respective sort of projects and works. And one that comes to mind, or one that came to my mind, is the notion of media archaeology. Because that seems to me to be a method that you share. And with media archaeology, I understand a sensitivity towards, or a sensitivity towards, or a recovery of media and technologies that are obsolete or no longer current, such as the 1997 computer, or the contemporary computer that thinks it's a 1997 computer, or what you wrote about, Esther, in your catalog text for Muses, this media archaeology of ether, the strange medium of ether. So media archaeology in the sense of how old media competes with our current understanding of what is modern and cutting edge, quite simply. So if I'm right about this, if there is something to that, what does a media archaeology?
I think it's kind of inside out in a way, because I was using those media when they weren't having to be archaeologicalized, when they were new. So. Yeah, when I was using those early computers. Now, I mean, there's all these groups sprung up in the universities, media archaeology groups, trying to work out how to actually maintain old technologies, so that stuff that had been done on earlier technologies could still be seen or played or viewed or something. So that there was that form of media archaeology, which was something that curators were supposed to learn about in order to access these previous works on older technologies. In that respect, I don't know how it totally relates to my work, because my work is the object in a way rather than the subject of this, if I'm using those terms correctly. Do you know what I mean?
But does that then add another sort of layer to it? That, I mean, the sense in which you, in talking about it, you're having to recreate a whole set of technologies and possibilities that were available.
I never realised at the beginning right at the beginning, I never thought this would be the case. I was looking this way, and now I'm looking this way, and it's really odd. But what happened, what I could say, is that at the end of the 90s, when I became very disillusioned with the internet and the onward thrust of technology and governmentization and corporatization of it all, and especially the internet, I rejected it all, more or less, and went back to traditional media as something that I could control myself, where I no longer had to keep up with the latest software, the latest mobile phone technology, the latest gizmo that the new media art festivals were wanting work made with or about.
But still you deal with one thing through the other. So, for instance, the Black Hole book that you mentioned and that I showed, I mean, it's mainly watercolor.
Well, yes, and it's using talking about technologies that don't exist as well. So I've stepped outside of, like the actual, real history of technology and technological process into something just in my head, really.
And I suppose that's what's sort of interesting for me, because partly to think archaeologically or to go back in time and to find these routes that were not taken. You see it around sort of cinema and animation technologies in the early days. People sort of set up systems that then went nowhere. To go back to that is similar to speculating forwards on what could come. And I suppose for me, that's part of I sort of want to say surrealizing it, or at least stepping aside from that demand that one's always up to date with the current technologies, and these are the only reality, and the way in which they exist is the only way in which they possibly can exist. It's about trying to open up the lost possibilities, future potentials that might yet be taken in. I mean, for me, it came less through a technological metaphor and more through Goethe's idea of the primal plant, the sort of originary plant into which all possible future is condensed and contained and can be sort of opened out at any point were the circumstances different or right in some way.
So there is a sense of transformation in there as well, or the possibility of transformation. Would that be?
Because otherwise, you just all you do is, which in a way I've done a bit here, but you paint a sort of horror picture of where we are, and it's as if there can be no other way of operating or interacting with this technology, but that can't be the case. It should be able to be unbound for all sorts of absurd and impractical and differently practical uses, I guess.
Speaking of your outlooks and strategies, I mean, you're not exactly techno-utopianists, any one of you, I guess. You're both critics of technology. You're both critics of the relations of production of technology and of the political economies of technology as well. And you're also both cartographers. I mean, you map out facts and cultural terrains. But at the same time, you seem to proceed in sort of in playful manners and you proceed with sort of sensualist attitudes as well. I think a common feature between your works is how you appeal to our senses as much as to our critical faculties. The nervous system is always stimulated and addressed, whether it's in your books, Esther, or in your works, Susie. Could you talk a bit about the relation between art and knowledge, or about aesthetics and critique?
But I think just your initial thing about critical of technology, I'm not critical of technology itself, I'm critical of the way that it's used. I think that's really important to differentiate. So, like, for example, in 1954, the French anarchist philosopher Jacques Ellul wrote this book called The Technological Society, where he talked about technology as something that that had its own internal mechanisms, that it would develop its own technologies itself. Like it was self-thinking in a sense. The way that it was constructed, it would determine its own future, and that human beings had to actually stand aside and control the way that technology would automatically develop if left, to its own devices. And so I think that's the problem. I think if someone like me was allowed to take control of the whole technology of the universe, we wouldn't be in quite the same situation, obviously, as we are now. I'm not quite sure what situation we'd be in, but it would be different. And of course, I could have become like a power-enthused maniac or something, but who knows? But why don't you ask Esther about your thing about the aesthetics? Because she's a political aesthetician.
It's true. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, but I think there are lots of ways I think about that. In that, I always think about what I do as a kind of trying to find the poetic and sensuous edge within sciences and technologies as a sort of technique to try to bring it closer again. I mean, and it's already there, and it's part of science communication as well. We see endless kind of, extraordinarily coloured pictures of outer space or the nano level or whatever. I mean, that's part maybe of a sort of fetishizing of science communication anyway, but I sort of want to do something of that for myself, which to me returns me to an older post-romantic notion of science in the 19th century, which was very much led by, certainly in Germany, by aesthetic questions and questions of observation, questions of analogy, and that we make meaning from this because it looks like that. And so there's a kind of slightly a mystical tinge to it, but to me that sort of brings it closer, brings it into the realm of my understanding. And I think we operate a lot through questions of intuition or affect, and that's a way of trying to induce a kind of state of mind that's maybe more receptive to the sort of links, and as you say, a mapping, but it's slightly crazy mapping that I want to lay out. So it's sort of working and trying to work in a slightly oniric sort of way, I think.
Did you want me to say anything?
No, I was just thinking. You said when we visited the exhibition, and it's the first time you've seen the exhibition, and you said that it made you feel dead. That was really not the point. Yeah, but I mean, with reference to the presentation of your works, it really wasn't the point to make you feel dead. But I guess it also had something to do with the context in which you made the works, because as you were talking about, their works from the late 80s and up till very recent works of yours. But when you worked with these things and with these technologies and media in the 80s and 90s in the UK, it was very different.
I suppose most of my early work, well, since I started getting into the idea of video games and technology and software and virtual reality and all these things, to be honest, I feel like I shouldn't have bothered, because no one really got it at that time. The Arts Council came to my studio and said, "What's a video game?" That was the culture I was in. It was like there was a youth culture which was habituated with those things. But in terms of my generation, and then I was in my 20s, people in their 20s didn't get it. And now, so what I find now is it's really only people in their 30s that actually get what I'm doing at all, still. And it's really depressing. Like, all my generation were not with me then, and they're not with me now. They haven't caught up even. They don't think these things are... They don't think about it. And for a long time, the whole new media art was in a ghetto. It was a self-imposed ghetto, because we all thought the mainstream art world was garbage, basically, and the whole system of it. So that was like a kind of self-induced failure mechanism in a way. And but at the same time, it really unfortunately does mean that the mainstream art world doesn't really have a clue about what happened in the 80s and 90s in a big sense. You have much more of a clue than most of them. But most of them just don't have a clue. And that's really, really odd, because there's no trace of it, especially, the whole internet thing. I mean, there's about 5 names that are kind of come out of net art, let's say Jody and whoever. But no one really gets what it was really about. No one really gets that, in terms of media archaeology, no one gets that the politics of it was the most important thing. Because the politics was the most important thing, that's why the art was the least important thing, and why the art world was irrelevant to people making that kind of work. And that is something that, from within the mainstream art world, cannot really be accommodated, in a sense. Because they're about the art. I don't know. It's different from other things. It's different from, it was a kind of countercultural period, and it's different from the 60s countercultural period. It's a different thing. It operated, in the same way it operated outside of the art world. It was about a different way of being. The early internet was about a different way of being, an idea that control could be held by not only governments, and that was actually actualized in different ways by people who were part of listserv groups and discussion groups, and the whole world connected up almost overnight in a completely different way, and information traveled in a completely different way. But that was so significant, and it wasn't just about art, but it was like a moment where everything overlapped. So art was part of it, and so artists who were part of that were part of this much bigger thing, and that whole big thing is something which is kind of invisibilized now.
Do you think that's though because, in a way, there was such a massive turnaround, so the internet became something very different, or is it just almost too recent or something?
No, I think it's because in about 2000 it turned into like a shop, and a control society thing, and that's when most people joined it.
Yeah. Okay, so most people came in, it was already...
I came back to London in 2000 from Australia, and I'd been coming every year, but suddenly in 2000, I was like on the London Underground, and every poster had www in 2-foot high letters, and I thought, what's this? London's discovered the internet. and thinks it's a shop. Right? Because all my friends had refused to go on email. That, I was saying, look, it takes you 2 weeks to write me get a letter to me in Australia. Look, I'll take you to Tarotkort Road. We'll get you a computer and we can communicate like this. Oh no, we don't want any of that. And then suddenly in 2000 they were saying, Susie, do you think you could take me shopping? I think I'd like to take you up on that offer now. You could explain to me how to use my computer and everything. I went, okay, but I knew that it wasn't for a good reason. Not really. And then maybe they were going to pay someone to make them a fancy website for their own self-marketing or something. It was just all backwards. It was just really depressing.
We need to get you back to talk about the history of all of this. I think we need to get you both back, actually, because there's so much to talk about. But anyway, you should also have the chance, you people in the audience. So if there's any questions to Susie and Esther.
Hi, thanks. One question concerning, you mentioned that when you went to Australia, you couldn't take your Amiga with you. How did that feel? Did it feel like you lost a tool, or you lost a language, or nothing at all? It's just like, okay, this period is over, now the next starts.
Well, not really. First of all, the thing is, when I went to Australia, I was going there because of a relationship, which I thought may only last 2 weeks. So it was all just like 1 week at a time, really. And then I found someone who had an Amiga computer, who was actually Francesca de Rimini, one of Viennese Matrix. She let me go to her house and use it when she wasn't on Lambda Mu, which she was most of the time, which is you probably might know what Lambda Mu is. And then, I don't know, I think I just always work with what I've got. I'd already done all these video game things. I'd kind of done them. I'd shown them in London. And I'd left. And I think about my work is it always jumps on to the next thing. So whatever is the next thing in my head, it jumps onto it. And so I went back to England. I had to go because of my visa after 6 months. And I got my computer back. And I did another series of those video game stills on the computer. But then I was more... I thought, I was getting interested in this idea of virtual spaces, and so that computer technology was quite primitive. It was all like, it looked like an embroidery. It was only this big. It was like, had to be less than a megabyte. I had to get an external hard drive, which was an extra 0.5 megabyte, in order to save some of these things. Otherwise, I'd lose them. And so it was kind of limited. And so it was interesting to try and go back to painting and do it in a you could get so much detail, and you could represent those things still. But so having been in that computer phase, I could then represent things that I'd understood from that computer space back in a painting, and then make a whole series of paintings as if they were put them in a big real space. I never actually showed any of them actually, but that's what I would have done. And then the idea of this software. So I think probably what happened is it's because my work became more and more about technology rather than using it, that probably installed that right from the start, because 1 minute I had it, then I didn't. And then so it really, in a way, it was more interesting to make work about technology using other media, and that's what ultimately I've ended up doing. Because when you use it, you're implicated in it. I mean, that's the thing. Everyone always talked about this, that, the software designers are designing your medium. You're not controlling it as much as you think you are,
Thank you so much for the talk. There are so many things to think about. I think I have a question for Esther. You talk a lot about the sort of blending of technology and nature, like referring to life as code and genetics as an operating system. And my question was, do you think of technology as another resource that we can sculpt, like a pot from mud, or is it an extension of our humanity?
It's, I mean, undoubtedly it is an extension, I suppose, or a grafting somehow that can and does extend what we are and what we can be. But I suppose it's like that thing of the web turning into a shop. I mean, we so quickly lose control of these things, and that's where I think about this sort of, you know, the kind of new materialist ideas of, you know, which echo the sort of Internet of Things, of sort of animate objects. You know, in some ways that's a capitulation, isn't it, to this sense in which it feels as if these systems and these things that are at the end of our fingertips all the time have their own autonomy, their own life, or they have something that becomes, I don't know, maybe saying against us is already too politically loaded, but certainly we become the instruments of our instruments, and we become constantly productive of stuff which is taken from us and used back on us in some way. So that's why I'm fearful, and it's quite a dystopian vision, but at the same time, I mean, that capacity is an extraordinary resource, isn't it? It's always the question of who gets to determine what one does with it, and unfortunately the uses are often just either banal or, you know, militaristic or for economy. I feel there's a sort of loss of control in a sense, which makes it not a happy resource for all of us, I guess.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we should say very many thanks to Suzanne Treister Esther for the wonderful presentations.
No,
it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.